Going live on YouTube, and here we go. Okay, we're up.
Okay, good morning, everyone, or seconds ago, good afternoon. And thank you for joining us for the 5th session of the Harris Center's ForecastNL series, Climate Change and Our Society. I'm Rob Greenwood, AVP Public Engagement and External Relations at Memorial and Director of the Harris Center. And wearing that hat here this afternoon. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located this morning, and to consider the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. The first few sessions of our 18-month-long project are looking at broad topics, and today is no exception, but we will be returning to a number of specific issues in much more detail in future sessions. So please feel free to send your suggestions our way. You can email us anytime, or if you have something to share now, send us a note in the chat box. Today's session is an overview of some of the ways climate change is impacting Newfoundland and Labrador's society. To get us started, we'll hear some opening remarks to set the stage, and a moderated discussion with our panelists will follow. After that, we'll open up the conversation for questions, so get ready. Feel free to post them in the Q&A box at any point during the session. We are recording today's session, which will be posted online afterwards. So if you aren't watching this live, you can still post questions for further discussion in our dedicated online forum at www.harriscenterforum.ca/forecast-NL. And you can find all that on the Harris Center website. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. Professor Barbara Neese is an honorary research professor in the Department of Sociology at Memorial University. Her research examines work, environment, and health in Atlantic Canadian marine and coastal communities. She is also a member of the steering committee for ForecastNL. Professor Mark Stoddard has worked at the Sociology Department at Memorial since 2010. His research and teaching covers environmental sociology, political sociology, social movements, and communication and culture, with interest in oil and energy, climate change, and tourism development. He recently co-authored Industrial Development and Ecotourism: Can Oil Extraction and Nature Conservation Coexist? Megan Sams is a Mi'kmaq artist, cloth maker, entrepreneur, owner of Live Textiles, and co-owner of Catalisk Sipu Gardens. Sorry, Megan, if I mispronounce that, you can correct it. An off-grid mixed mini farm and apothecary in Codroy Valley. And finally, Josh Smee is CEO of Food First Newfoundland and Labrador and a community developer with experience in a wide range of nonprofits and social enterprises, including the Community Sector Council NL and Choices for Youth. Josh also spent 6 years as board chair of the St. John's Farmer Market Cooperative, helping lead the planning and development of the new permanent community market in St. John's. We just had a great conversation waiting for us to start on farming and agriculture and gardening. So we may just switch today's session to the phone in on gardening. No, we won't. But it may come up. It's a big topic in relation to climate change. So thank you all for joining us. It's now my pleasure to ask Mark to provide us with an overview of the impacts of climate change on our province's society. Over to you, Mark.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you to everyone who's joining this afternoon. So I think I've been working in the sociology of climate change as a research area for about a decade now. So it's very hard to condense that into a 5-minute opening statement. So I think, rather than try to say everything about everything, I'll give some of the big 5 points, kind of really high picture, high level takeaways that come to my mind when I think of why we need a social lens on climate impacts and responses. Because I mean, for me, the impacts and responses go very much hand in hand. And the first of the 5 I would say is that in terms of the big pictures, we more or less have a pretty good understanding of the science of climate change right now. The scientific consensus as kind of represented by the IPCC, that kind of stuff, the broad strokes, we kind of know what's going on, right? At this point, the main obstacles to making progress on climate change tend to be more political and social. They're not necessarily scientific, and to a large extent, not even necessarily technological. So that's the first reason why a social lens becomes very important to understanding what's going on there. Second point, I think quite relatedly, we do have this kind of very macro level kind of global climate regime that's made up by the IPCCs, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN kind of facilitated Conference of the Parties meetings that happen every year, etc. So I think a social lens also becomes really vital for thinking about how this kind of global climate regime translates or doesn't into national or regional or local municipal level climate action and responses, right? And what resonates, what doesn't. I mean, we need to understand these things as well, right? That as we think about how climate knowledge, scientific knowledge or action works between these different scales, from the global to the very local. Third off, there's the ideas in climate change kind of discussions about responsibility, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity. So for those that are a bit unfamiliar, when we talk about responsibility, we're thinking about which countries maybe have had historically the biggest carbon footprints or currently have the biggest carbon footprints. We might think about that in a per capita sense. So for example, Canada and Australia have massively disproportionate carbon footprints on a per capita basis. Or we might think about, populations within a country, right? In terms of more, affluent consumerist kind of classes within a society, right? So that's what we're thinking about when we think about responsibility. Vulnerability is who is actually vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change, the sea level rise, the increasingly intense storm cycles, hurricane seasons, precipitation, coastal erosion, kind of complete changes to landscape and ecologies in northern communities, for example. So vulnerability and responsibility we're often talking about very different societies or groups of folks, right? And finally, adaptive capacity is really all about having the resources, the knowledge, the know-how, the financial resources, the infrastructure to adapt to what our new environments are going to be looking like in coming years and decades. And so when we think about responsibility, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity, all three of those things are very bound up with issues of social power, of political capacity and efficacy, of access to resources. And those dynamics, those social dynamics, play out at multiple levels from the global. If we're talking about the global north compares to the global south, they play out at the national level. So we might be talking about, the Canadian oil and gas sector and its kind of responsibility for our carbon footprint versus communities that are more vulnerable and at risk, which are predominantly coastal and northern communities. Or we might be talking about it more on the regional or local scale, right? I mean, here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we might often be talking about urban-rural differences in ability to adapt to what's coming in coming years and decades. Or we might also think about something like Muskrat Falls, which has to make it into this conversation somehow, so I'll just bring it in right at the front, where it might actually help, on one hand, move us towards a lower carbon energy transition, arguably not, but by displacing Holyrood. At the same time, it has very significant negative downstream impacts or risks for downstream communities, right? So it's got its own very tangly relationship with how we think about climate change, and gives a good example of how sometimes something that's sold as a climate solution can also have downstream negative impacts, negative social impacts, right? And that's kind of my fourth point that I wanted to raise, is that our thinking about climate solutions is often really dominated by market-oriented or economistic and technological solutions that often kind of target us as individual consumers. But when we don't have a kind of a strong social lens on how we deal with climate change it becomes very easy for market-oriented solutions or technologically oriented solutions to amplify our existing social inequalities, whether we're talking about economic inequality, gender inequality, or in kind of a broader global scale, global north, global south kinds of inequalities, right? So that's another reason why the social lens is really, really vital to see how our climate solutions, to ensure that they don't just perpetuate social inequalities or magnify existing inequalities. And finally, and relatedly, the social lens, I think, is really good in a more maybe positive or productive sense when we think about pursuing climate action that also contributes to more equitable, just, and sustainable societies that can contribute to community well-being, right? That produces the kind of win-wins that we hope to see that both do climate mitigation and adaptation while also help building community resilience, sustainability, and well-being locally or provincially, right? So I think all 5 of those reasons or points are, I think, really, to me, get at the core of why a social lens is so important, because climate mitigation and adaptation is very intimately bound up with issues of equity, inequality, the social dimensions of sustainability, and also thinking about these multiple levels that climate change plays out at, from the global UN kind of COP meetings to our local landscapes in the Codroy Valley or St. John's or Labrador. And so I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mark, and gives us a sense of the broad scope and many potential implications. So maybe we'll start with you, Megan. If you want to add to or riff off some of what Mark said there in terms of key implications of climate change on society in this province from your perspective.
So my initial thoughts there, my perspective is very local. You mentioned the urban-rural divide, Mark, and being on the West Coast, the far West Coast, we are pretty geographically divided from the closest urban center in Codroy Valley. So, I look at a very micro society sort of climate here versus an urban setting is very different. Like, we're a very tight, small knit community. And just what we do on the day-to-day is quite different than an urban setting. And anyways, that's one thing that pops up for me in your opening statement there is, we need sort of very local or regional actions and solutions because our very local societies are a little bit different, overarching. They're similar, but
one size does not fit all.
One size does not fit all. And I think resilient community investment, grassroots investment in terms of like action and labor, not necessarily monetarily, is somewhere that I focus my work on.
Well, thanks, Megan. And maybe Josh, moving from the very local, you have a provincial mandate with a lot of what you do, but of course it plays out on the ground and in the ground when we talk about food security. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Your thoughts opening on what Mark had to say and your own perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and thanks for starting the food puns early. That's great. That's always a good foundation for one of these things. A few thoughts on that. I mean, I think when we're talking about the social implications and the societal implications of climate change, it's not just because it's my job that my head comes around to how it's going to impact our food systems. I think that's one of the primary terrains we're going to see some major change on. And from my perspective, I think there's a few things I think about a lot. And one of them is I'm not sure we're yet in a place where we're comfortable having this conversation as a province. There's still a lot of tension and reluctance and politics about being honest about what climate change is going to mean in our day-to-day lives and in our food systems in particular. And I think things are sometimes clouded by something that you hear sometimes in my world, which is there's a little bit of optimism about climate change in the food space, right? Sometimes people's default response is to think about its impact on growing seasons, how that might extend or widen what we can produce in the province. And I'm not discounting that. It is a real impact, but I think once you take a deeper dive into what the actual impact of the climate crisis is on our food systems, it's much more complex and much less likely to be unambiguously positive. We're talking about the disruptions that we'll see from unstable weather and from other sort of unpredictability within those systems that'll, I think, largely offset some of the season impacts. And we'll also see what we're already seeing, many of our traditional foodways being badly broken, right? If you talk to anyone on the north coast of Labrador and ask them how their relationship is to country foods now as compared to 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, that's already happening. It's disproportionate, of course, on the north coast. And I think as climate change rolls onward, we'll also see that level of disruption roll southward, that folks who are traditional foodways on the island as well will be more and more disrupted. The other piece of this, I think, that we haven't grappled with really societally is what are the implications of the mitigation and adaptation measures that we're talking about doing. So I've never heard anyone really game out what would a really functional carbon tax mean to our food system. And I'm all for a carbon tax personally. I think it's a good policy instrument. But I don't think anyone has ever done the work to show what would that mean? How would that alter the balance between, for example, the price of producing something locally versus importing it, especially when lots of local producers rely on imported inputs into their food. So it's a really complex set of conversations around the social impacts we'll see in our food systems, and I'm just not sure we're talking about them yet. And I think the other thing that Mark really sort of set the stage for, and speaking of uncomfortable conversations, I think the other one that we are not having as loudly as we could be is around the sort of the intergenerational equity impacts here, right? That we are mining the future to pay for the present right now, right? And my parents' generation did it. My generation is doing it. I have a 2.5-year-old who will grow up in a world with much more constrained options than I had. And I don't think we are yet in a place as a province to recognize that that's the case. And I wish we were. And I think there's some work to be done if we're going to adapt to make that a conversation that we can have around the dinner table with our families, because it's still hard even there. So I think that's what is really brought to mind by Mark kind of setting the stage in terms of framing, is just how much is still on the table about really being honest with ourselves.
Thanks, Josh. Barb, you've looked at these issues from a lot of perspectives. Anything you'd like to lead off on in this conversation?
I think if we're going to look at the impacts of climate change on our society, we have to be aware that, those impacts are going to unfold over a long period of time, and they won't be separate from a whole lot of other changes that are going on. And I think we also have to start with the acknowledgement that we're an incredibly open, independent society. Like, we're highly dependent on food production, goods production, money and transportation flows that are really dictated from elsewhere, including work elsewhere. We have a large labor force that works in other places. And we're open and vulnerable also in terms of, many of the goods we produce are exported into global markets. And we're open to environmental change in a profound kind of way because we are marine and coastal. And we're quite isolated and we're spread out over long distances, right? So we have a huge transportation infrastructure, we have a hydro infrastructure, and all of these things that are incredibly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. But the thing that we also have to think about is that we're not all equally vulnerable, right? And I know this is a key point that we really need to, it's the point about vulnerability that Mark raised, and I think that we really have to pay attention to. So who is going to be affected? How are they going to be affected? And who has the resources and the capacity and the options to move on? So globally, climate change is going to mean more expensive food, right? So, we can talk about growing more food locally, but the food we grow locally is not cheap. for the most part, we're not well positioned in terms of feeding our population. It would take a massive shift in our infrastructure and many other changes. And so food is going to be more expensive. Well, who can afford expensive food and who can't afford? And we already have a situation because we have high levels of poverty and inequality in the province. We have many people who live in food deserts, who have difficulty getting good quality food and feeding their families and their health and other implications from that. And food's just one of the things we're talking about. You talk about transportation, or you talk about wharves and infrastructure in rural communities. You know, we rely heavily on shipping. Our fishing industry requires wharves. All of those things are vulnerable to climate change, right? So extreme events, if we think back to Igor, in terms of the societal impacts of Igor, right? The washing out of roads, the washing out of, you know, the destruction of the Catalina fish plant, you know, it was massive in terms of its effects, and it was one small extreme event, very, very costly. So you have the question of who's going to pay for it. You have the loss of that plant because once it was damaged by Igor, the company decided not to reopen it. So then you have the displacement of 500 workers, and where do they go? And so on and so forth. So, I mean, there are huge, huge questions here that we have to start to grapple with. And you can say, well, you know, it is, as Mark points out, there's a global level to this, a regional level, and a local level. We can say, well, we're not a big part of the problem, but we are a part of the problem. We produce, and our economy is based on oil and gas. The future of that sector is in jeopardy, and it's contributing to serious problems here and globally. So we need to address it. And we need to not be the last people on the train when it comes to greening our society and our economy. And if we're going to do it in a way that speaks to, I think, the fundamental requirements of climate justice, so that we come out of this a better, more equitable, more joyous, creative, supportive, grounded society, then we've got to get moving now.
Thanks, Barb. And Barb, I'll go to Mark next, actually, I think, because Barb and Josh both mentioned some of the inequities of some of the impacts in society. And that is a concern that gets raised a lot about how different people, different places will be impacted differently. Mark, did you want to elaborate on that? And then I'll turn to the other panelists a little more on that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, you know, Barb's touched on quite a bit already. And I think if we think about part of living with climate change here in Newfoundland and Labrador, is we are expecting to live with, you know, increasingly severe storm seasons, hurricanes, things like Snowmageddon. And in those cases, it's the most vulnerable who are the most vulnerable, right? It's generally the elderly, people with disabilities, people of lower incomes. And that's, I think, like Barb mentioned with food systems, that very much plays out as well. But I think that's, if we think about the direct kind of ecological climate impacts on our region, you know, it's going to be the most vulnerable who are the most vulnerable, without putting a social lens on how we adapt, on how we respond, right? And consciously try to mitigate that, right? And so it's, I say that it's the most vulnerable who are most vulnerable, not to promote acceptance of that fact, but to say, no, like that's why we need a social lens, right? To attend to this in our climate planning, our adaptive planning. I think the other great point Barb just raised too, is our being an oil and gas dependent region. A way I hadn't really framed impacts, but it certainly is an impact, is we are very connected. We're very globally connected. And, you know, if we are a laggard region as the rest of the world is moving ahead on low carbon transitions, on green energy transitions, we are then creating, making choices that create social and economic risks for our province as well. If we become a laggard region while the train's pulling out of the station, in this global community that we're a part of, while we continue to kind of double down in oil and gas, that's also, we're making political choices that also create potential impacts down the road in 5, 10, 15 years, in terms of that we'll also have to live with, that could be a different kind of storm or extreme weather event, right? Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Megan, from your perspective, the inequity of the way these changes are impacting, anything you'd want to add to that?
Sorry, can you say that again, Rob? I just want to
when
hear.
you think of the inequitable impacts of climate change on different people, on different places. From your perspective, what's most telling on that front?
I feel like Barb is best situated to answer that. But I do, as a rural person all my life, and on the farthest west coast, I really keep coming back to the urban and the rural divide. But I do want to pass that over to Barb. I feel like she can speak to that question.
No, fair enough. And Barb, you have touched on some of that, but on the inequity of climate change impacts, where would you highlight?
Well, let's just think about how our society exists, right? So we have urban areas like St. John's, okay? So we just saw Snowmageddon, right? Snowmageddon is the kind of thing we might expect more of with climate change. Well, how did Snowmageddon work its way out in terms of this community, right? So again, who got locked into their homes, who had to have neighbors to come and dig them out, right? Or people with disabilities who rely on public transit, people who have been injured and are in their home and need home care, and the home care workers couldn't even get to them, right? So you have these immediate effects. And then if you have a major hurricane and so on, people lose their roofs, the housing is destroyed. You have all of this rain and flooding that happens. And again, that could happen perhaps to any house, but it's going to be more damaging to houses that are already shoddily built, in part because of poverty. And, in places where you might have rooming houses and so on, where people have very few options and very little control over the infrastructure of the housing within which they live, right? So then who gets left behind? We saw with New Orleans, it was very, very clear, right? The most at risk were the Black poor communities, basically many of them displaced, more likely to be killed, lost their homes, and then the developers came in and took over that territory and so on and so forth, right? And so there was a legacy for decades that's ongoing there from an extreme event. So we have to be thinking about those things. We have to be thinking about the point that Josh raised, which I think is an important point, about basically the potential for conflict here, right? Whether it's based on social class or whether it's based on issues of gender and so on and so forth. Who benefits primarily from the oil and gas sector in terms of employment and so on and so forth? Who loses? Basically, if we, lose our public health infrastructure, we lose our transportation structure or whatever, right? So there are different groups who are differently positioned relative to how the economy currently operates and how it, in fact, could operate, I think, in the future. And the literature is pretty clear that women are more vulnerable to climate change, that the disabled are more vulnerable to climate change. They have racial inequalities and other types of inequalities. And again, I think rural is critically important here. We've invested massively in Muskrat Falls. We have a highly vulnerable hydro transportation system, highly vulnerable to climate change, right? So that system goes down. We have another dark NL. Who's got the resources to buy a generator, keep the food in their freezer from freezing, get food and so on, and survive in the midst of that chaos?
No, very tangible examples there, Barb. Josh, you talked a bit about intergenerational inequity. Don't know if you want to elaborate on that some more or other aspects from your perspective.
I think I might just expand on something Barb was saying, but because I think she drew a useful lens around this. Thinking about 2020 was actually a really good example year for the years we can expect from now to come, right? Not to say we'll have another pandemic or another massive snowstorm, but we are going to see these kind of destabilizing events, and we're not going to be able necessarily to predict what and how they play out. And I think one thing that we learned very clearly over 2020 was that our social safety net is not built to withstand that level of instability. So it was already inadequate, I think, in an era before that instability, but it is doubly inadequate when people are facing these kind of disruptive events. There are, I think, and we do have a bit more of an awareness as a society now than we did a year and a half ago of how many households are one disruption away from crisis, right? Folks who like, as long as things are sailing along smoothly, you might not notice that folks are living on the margins. But those crises are going to come more often. Those disruptions are going to come more often, and we're not right now prepared to cope with it as a society, either culturally or in our sort of social infrastructure. I think that's a really important sort of context for this conversation we're now having about the future of the province. And it's not that we're kind of reorganizing around status quo in terms of need, right? And that's a really important point to emphasize. And I think thinking about those kind of intergenerational questions, I think that's a real challenge, right? Because someone who grew up when I did or when my parents did will have an instinctively wrong sense of the level of vulnerability around, right? And I think that's one of the points of conflict, is conveying the seriousness of some of these impacts when it conflicts with our gut sense of what the social fabric looks like, right? And that's, so there's a point of conflict and tension there, and I think our systems are really not yet in any way set to respond to them. And we don't even really have the vehicle to raise this as an issue half the time, you know? So when we're into a conversation about what does, say, our income support system look like, we should probably be talking about this first, but we don't. And so there's just, I think, again, these kind of structural pieces that are not there around this, and the impact on that is that there are just, you know, Mark's raising the sort of vulnerability language, there are a lot more people who are in that vulnerable column. And I think we have this kind of classist way of thinking about what vulnerability looks like, which is that it's associated with sort of a certainly, so I live in St. John's, and there's a kind of attitude towards generational poverty in the city and what that looks like, and that is not the only face of vulnerability to climate change, right? And I think there's some work to do to expand our understanding of what vulnerability even looks like, and we haven't quite got there yet.
So lots of issues there, lots of vulnerabilities. But I know as we plan this session, speaking to four of you, you're not doom and gloom. You were raising examples of things that are being done and more that can be done at different levels: local, provincial, national, international. Megan, you've been clear on and kind of illustrate lots of ways at the local level. Did you want to lead off with some of what that ultimate question on what is to be done and what can be done, and some existing successes, you think?
Sure. I did want to just touch quickly on something that was brought up there that, you know, Josh, I've really started thinking about, you know, you mentioned it's been taking these major disruptions or weather events or catastrophes to see who is vulnerable. And it's very unfortunate that it's taking these disruptions to see who's on the margins. And so I think by cultivating community resiliency and looking at what is being done and what is working, sorry about that, we can address who's vulnerable before the catastrophe happens, so we don't have to see who's suffering via a catastrophe. So some things that are happening here in my community, for example, is a community service garden, and this garden is in partnership with our credit union, the Leading Edge Credit Union. And it's a space behind the building for garden beds, greenhouse, And it's not a community garden in the traditional sense. All of the crops that come out of there will go toward our fire hall, for example, which is volunteer. They do probably half a dozen fundraising meals a year. They buy their storage crops to do these fundraisers, and the fish plant donates lobsters. So if we can donate the potatoes and the turnip or whatever to their fundraiser, then that's a community service. Beyond that, we'll be having produce giveaway days. So we're just giving the food away that's produced out of that garden. So it's a bit of a volunteer model. It's a community garden in the sense that it serves the community, but no one has their own plots because we're so rural. There are a lot of, and we have an agricultural history. There's a lot of space for gardens and larger farms here. So this is something we didn't necessarily require, was a community garden. So that's something that I see really works. And if we look outward, I mean, my interest is looking inward, in looking to Newfoundland to see what's working across Newfoundland and Labrador and just do more of the same. And to cultivate more consensus and find out what people on the ground want and do that. But if we do look outward, the conversation around climate change is a little more advanced elsewhere. So I think if we can close the education gap around climate change here, that will help us prevent these vulnerabilities in the face of a catastrophe, and put systems in place on a community level to assist the vulnerable without them having to go through more trauma to see who's at risk. So I guess it's a harm reduction model in that way too.
Great, thank you. Josh, from your perspective, solutions that are happening now or could be more?
Yeah, I think I've been actually very heartened by how much the window has shifted on what is considered possible in social policy in the last few months and years. So I am personally, and our organization is a big advocate of the universal basic income as a part of these kind of responses. And I think in general of thinking about universalized responses. So I think we're up the creek if we are trying to design a giant snowstorm response program, and then we figure out a pandemic response program and a hurricane response team, and like that's a senseless way to do things. But can we strengthen these kind of universal systems that would be an effective adaptation to all of that instability? And I think the conversation around basic income has really moved in the last year. It is now a legitimate policy option that is debated for good reason, because there's lots of complex conversations around it from a implementation perspective, from an equity perspective, but it's not something that is laughed out of the room. And 18 months ago, it would have been. We're sitting here today and all three provincial parties endorsed it in their election platforms, right? That doesn't mean it's going to happen, because they all said the Fed should pay for it. And so, take that for what it is. But, that window has really moved. And I think from my perspective, those conversations are really important, because once you're arguing about the details of things, that's a much more productive conversation to have. What would a UBI look like? How would we pay for it? Those are really important. But those are the conversations that are starting to happen. Our neighbors in PEI already endorsed one and are pushing hard for federal engagement on it, but their report said they'll go it alone if they have to. It'd be nice if we beat them to it. I think there's a lot of space in the Atlantic region for cooperation around a better social model. And there's reasons why our jurisdictions are well sized for that. So I think that's where I'm seeing inspiration right now is around these kind of more universalized solutions. And I'm conscious that I'm talking from an adaptation perspective. And I just want to name, I'm personally not a huge optimist about mitigation of climate change itself. And so I'm starting to think, I think where my head is already going as to how do we mitigate the impacts of what that'll look like in our society. And that is where those kind of programs come in. I think we are also seeing, to Megan's point, there's a real upswelling of work happening in smaller and rural communities around more locally sustainable systems. And we're in the position that we see a lot of that work emerging right now. And I think there are pieces of that that'll have a really meaningful impact on what the lived experience of being, particularly in a smaller community in Newfoundland and Labrador or Atlantic Canada, is going to be. What's available at your fingertips in the context of this bigger shift that we're going through. There's a lot of good work happening.
Thanks, Josh. And I see our chat box. We're starting to get people interested in asking questions, and we want to get to that. But Barb and Mark, maybe short snappers. Start with Barb. Any key perspectives from your view on solutions?
Go to Mark. Okay, Rob?
Okay. Mark.
Sure. Yeah. So I'd say that at the local and community level, there's a lot to be done around infrastructures, building retrofits, or green design kind of codes, things like that for new buildings. A lot to be done around increasing public infrastructure and access for public transportation and active transportation, as well as to protecting community green space and blue space as kind of a green infrastructure, to use kind of the planning language. And most of those things kind of fall under the win-win kind of solution banner, right? Like they're things that contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation, but when done well, they also increase community well-being and inclusion, right? And they build more inclusive communities. That said, I also don't want to forget that as a multi-level problem, a lot of the solutions we're going to need to see are beyond the individual and community level. So do require us to keep some political pressure, right? That there's our energy systems for the province, our reliance on the oil and gas sector. Those aren't necessarily as easy to deal with at the local level. So it does require us to think about it in terms of how we vote and political pressure and so on. And I think with the social ones in mind, to also ensure that this is done with just transitions in mind, right? That it's not just a matter of, I don't think anybody's advocating in putting that political pressure out there that it's shut down the oil and gas sector without a transition plan, right? That mitigates rather than amplifies, who might be impacted negatively by that. So yeah, I guess that's my closer on what's to be done.
Yeah. Right on. Thank you, Mark. Yeah. So I think, Kathy, we have some questions showing up in the Q&A and some discussion in the chat. Any particular ones you want to start with there, Kathy?
Sure. We actually have a question from Elizabeth Beale, who happens to also be on our steering committee. But she asks, Barb linked addressing climate change to making progress on creating less unequal and more joyous society. What do others think of that? Is it important to link progress on climate change to addressing social injustice and inequality? Or does this turn off those in business or those who may not still be convinced of the necessity to address climate change?
Thanks, Kathy. So I think various of the panel hit on that as well. Who would like to jump in on that first? Mark, I'm going to pick on you.
I think following from my last comments, I think to me, it's actually pretty vital. I think that the climate solutions that I suspect will ultimately be the most successful are the win-wins, the ones that actually contribute to social well-being as well. So I just think of places that, I've done field work or familiar with, but Copenhagen comes to mind as a city that's often lauded as globally one of the real climate leaders. When you think of what they've done with kind of building retrofits and new construction, cycling infrastructure, they've really, in pursuit of climate action, created one of the most, livable cities in the world right now, arguably. They're also a low-lying coastal city, so they're also particularly vulnerable to a lot of what we're talking about. But we can also think about, time spent in Vancouver, and I know the Sustainability Center building at UBC, just to give a really micro example, built according to very green principles. That's a beautiful building that's become the most desirable space for people to work and teach in. And it's a net positive building that contributes back into the grid more energy that it uses. It has biofiltration of incoming rainwater, so water leaves the building cleaner than it comes in, stuff like that. So, this, by scaling up these kinds of solutions, I think it's absolutely, yeah, like integral, vital that our climate solutions also, get social buy-in, that they increase people's happiness and sense of social sustainability.
Josh, you were looking like you were going to jump in, or Megan?
Oh, Megan has a hand.
Yeah. Megan, go ahead.
So as a business person, like our businesses are modeled around the importance of mitigating and slowing down climate change and investing in our communities. And I actually find it very exciting. Like I have been in the School of Forestry building at UBC. That might be one that you were talking about, Mark. And it is incredible. And it's so exciting that the water coming in leaves cleaner. And, here on our farm, we use regenerative farming practices. And so it's constantly motivating us to think differently than what is held up in the Western norm, and by way of reclaiming practices that are extremely rooted to place, we're constantly thinking about, foods that are more important to this place. And that is so exciting. Like Jerusalem artichokes are incredibly more important than mangoes, and for example. And so it requires a cultural shift, but how does cultural shift develop? It develops in businesses and art and the boots on the ground. So I think the question was about, is it important to link progress in climate change to those in business, and is social injustice and inequality important to those in business? And I think it's not only important, it's a bare responsibility if you're going to be in business in our province.
Thanks, Megan. And I'm sure Josh and Barb could jump in. Want to get to other questions, but do you have a real compelling point you want to make before we move on? No? You okay? Good. Kathy, what's up next?
Okay, so I have a question here from Nicholas, and he asks, what's the level of preparedness of rural communities to extreme climate events? Urban centers like St. John's have published corporate climate plan. What can rural communities do to become more prepared? And what's the role of regional service boards? So it's a bit of a different question, but I think it's really important.
Who would like to jump in on that one first? I'll pick on Megan as the rural liver. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So that I think has a complicated answer. My community is unincorporated. We don't have a regional board. We don't have everything that we do have is privatized, or like the snow plowing is transportation of highways, but that doesn't include small community roads. That's just the main roads. So we don't have a plan. Basically, we have each other. That's what we have in the valley. But I would hope that other more formalized regional areas and municipalities have something, but I can't really speak to what's outside of the valley.
Of course, there's a lot of discussion province-wide with municipalities, Newfoundland and Labrador and others, on regionalization of services, the need for regional planning. And there are regional boards for landfills province-wide that could take on other roles. Others want to jump in on this topic?
Yeah, I would just say, so to jump in, at the risk of jumping in, this is one of the places that the inequalities around urban rural, I think, is particularly stark, where we think about adaptive capacity, right? Who's got the human resources, financial resources to plan and implement adaptation. And I know municipalities NL and the province have tried to push that conversation. I know the province has prepared toolkits and things like that, but if you send it to communities that are very overstrapped and under-resourced, and people don't have the time and capacity to do adaptation planning or implementation, then it's not really going to go very far. Like we also need so there we really get into questions about inequalities of resource allocations for people to be able to plan and implement for adaptation.
Governance capacity, obviously, a key underlying piece on all of this at all levels. Again, we're getting lots of questions in, but Barb or Josh, if you want to jump in on this one quickly. If not,
I might
Yeah,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Barb.
okay.
We jumped at the same time now.
Yeah, that's okay. So just again, to make Mark's point that rural communities, well, municipalities in general, including non-municipalities, the sort of local service districts, just do not have the resources or the capacity for planning. And, that's a fundamental failure of the provincial government to not address that problem by essentially establishing and supporting elected structures in rural areas, and then making sure that enough tax dollars flow back to them to provide the supports they need to have much more control over the development of their own futures and to work with people in their communities. So it's got to be addressed, and it's not limited to climate change. But everybody says, oh, they come to us and they want us to rescue us when they lose their roads, and they do this and they do that. But we've designed, a pork barrel economy that basically says you don't get anything unless you come to us and we'll give it to you. And then we blame them for a pork barrel economy.
Josh, a quick one on this.
Yeah, I think Barb largely hit on it, that responding at the rural level doesn't mean that it has to always be local governments leading that response. Where if as long as we've designed a system that concentrates resources in other places, then there has to be that rural distribution of infrastructure, right? And I think the other thing that we hear a lot in my world is some of the regulatory and sort of behind the scenes policy infrastructure is not a great fit for doing things in smaller, more rural contexts, like or at smaller scales, or supporting cottage industries. So if we're thinking about that infrastructure is not just physical, right? It can also be taking a rural lens on what the barriers are to more innovative approaches. And a lot of those barriers are policy based and live in St. John's.
Kathy, another one.
Sure. I have 2 more questions, and we've got about 8 minutes left. So we'll ask, I think we have time for 2 more. So I've got a question here. How does everyone feel about including grassroots Indigenous peoples into the rooms that decide what happens?
And Kathy, I think what we'll do, and we'll see how attentive our panelists are, ask the other question also, and I'll go through the panel one by one and let them address both or either, and then their concluding comment also. So what's your second question you got queued up?
Sure. It's a 2-parter, so you're really going to have to pay attention, panelists. Sorry. How effectively and constructively can the Harris Center discussion of climate change be linked with the approaches to the NL economic crisis? So that's kind of the first part that comes from one of the audience members. And my second half to that question is, how can approaches to climate change effectively and constructively address the NL economic crisis? So kind of broadening it past just the Harris Center discussion, because I think that's a key piece, but also how can climate change adaptation and mitigation in general impact the NL economic crisis?
So fair warning, not really fair, but I'm going to start with Barb, and then Megan, then Josh. I'll finish with you, Mark. So Barb, either or all of those questions, your final thoughts or response on that?
Well, the question about engaging or involving grassroots Indigenous people in all of these discussions, I think applies not just to Indigenous people, but it applies across the board to the vulnerable groups that we've talked about. That for the most part, people with disabilities have not been actively, and their representatives have not been actively engaged in climate change discussions or economic recovery discussions in this province. Precariously employed workers who are, who comprise most of our young workers are precariously employed. Where are they, and how have they been brought into these discussions? And their incomes, I know my own children, their incomes are right on the margin. All it would take would be one major push to push them over. Right. And that's a lot of the next generation that's raising the next generation of children with expensive costs. So there are many groups who have not been brought to the table And we really haven't had a meaningful, deep, solid discussion in this province around how do we respond to climate change and where does it fit in terms of our larger trajectory and the issues that we're facing, which brings us to the fiscal situation that we'll have or that we're dealing with now. And we all knew this was going to come up in this conversation. So from that point of view, I mean, that's a big conversation. But my response would be really that we cannot plan our way forward by basically simply having a conversation with the same people who got us into this situation to begin with, right? That we cannot simply rely on a few elite people in our society, whether they're politicians or business leaders, all of who benefited from the billions that were spent, much more than many other people did in this province, to find our way forward. We need a different strategy and a more inclusive strategy. And that's where the ideas are. We have to find the other alternative ideas rather than continuing to say we're in crisis, we have to march forward, we have to take our leadership from this narrow elite.
Thanks, Barb. Megan, responses to any or all of those questions?
Well, so I think Newfoundland and Labrador, by inviting grassroots Indigenous people, vulnerable groups, people with low income, people with disabilities, by inviting these people into the rooms that decide what happens, that is what's going to address the economic situation and the climate situation at once. Like Barb said, having a diverse representation and also restructuring governance a little bit to include room for those voices and looking toward consensus and looking generations ahead and behaving responsively versus reactively to the situation. So by incorporating our past, present, and our future, thinking about time a little bit differently and looking ahead with decisions and actions, and having an Indigenous perspective and methodology in the room that decides what happens, will do that. So I feel very strongly about that, actually.
Thanks, Megan. Josh, your final thoughts on those questions and for the panel.
Yeah, to think about Indigenous perspectives, I think it's worth expanding on that it's not just about ensuring that there's an Indigenous presence in the room, but about creating rooms that are run by Indigenous folks, right? Like, I think there needs to be, and this is a conversation we are not having as a province, about not just partnership, but like devolution of power and responsibility and resources, and that's particularly true in food systems to Indigenous communities to run their own food systems, make their own decisions, and show leadership in that way. And there's, we can talk about Indigenous food sovereignty movements for a long time here, and we don't have time now, and it's a complex landscape of what that looks like, right? But I just say, like, it's not just about a seat at the table. I think there's also creating new tables or allowing new tables to be created and creating space for decision making to happen in a different way than white people like me are used to is really important. Like, there's a kind of vocabulary of power, right? Of just like how we talk about decisions and how we frame what's possible. And I think we need to push back against some of that stuff. So it's a really fundamental question of what does a more indigenized response look like, right? And I'm not the one to answer that, but I think it's like we need just to say that to take a really stronger lens on that. And we've been staying away from the green reports by and large in this conversation. I'm happy to do it, but I think it's really, the green report's a good example of how we think about in relationships with Indigenous communities now, which is as sort of partnerships on specific issues and as folks to have in the room. But I would love for that to move to a more fundamental reorganizing of how we make our decisions on that. On the sort of broader kind of connection with recovery, since we're talking about that, I think it goes beyond framing this province in the context of sort of benefiting from the green technological transition. That is a big part of how climate crisis would connect to economic recovery. But I think the other part is more where Mark is coming from, and where some of this conversation around the fact that the things we would do to make a more climate resilient and less climate impactful province also just make this a better place for people to live. And if, there's no way for this province, I mean, preaching to the Rob Greenwood choir here, there's no way for us to survive without significantly improved retention of young people and attraction of immigrants. And a good way to get there is to build climate resilient communities that are really nice places to live, right? Like we're competing on a market for people who are going to look at us and they're going to look at, I don't know, say Halifax, just to pick on Halifax. And if we're not getting really serious about climate adaptation and mitigation measures, we're going to lose. And so I think that's the other way that this is a key part of our kind of competitiveness for people and in the future. And that's, I think, a framing that's important in the context of economic recovery that sometimes gets there and sometimes gets lost, right?
Thanks, Josh. Well, you opened us up, Mark. We've covered a lot of ground in this broad topic, but some very nice shapes emerging.
Yeah.
Your final thoughts on the questions, or any final comment on the whole session?
No, I'll give a couple quick responses to the final questions. Yeah, I think in terms of Indigenous participation, grassroots Indigenous participation, I would say that's imperative on speaking as a settler Canadian, that's imperative on us as settlers and settler governments, partly, because Canada is a signatory to UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We hypothetically say we support principles like FPIC, free and prior and informed consent, that we should respect that. And climate change is intimately bound up with issues around resource extraction, oil and gas development, et cetera, where it's almost inescapable that we're going to be getting into conversations about what happens in terms of resource development on Indigenous lands. So if we take UNDRIP at all seriously as a settler government, we have to have those spaces for inclusion in these conversations. Also in Canada and in Newfoundland and Labrador, for the most part, Indigenous communities have not been amongst the most responsible for creating this problem. But on the flip side, they are often more vulnerable and have lesser adaptive capacity, right? So just from a pure climate justice perspective, there's also, I think, a moral imperative, not just a kind of political, legal imperative. So I guess that would be my response to the first question. On the second one, on how this relates to the economic crisis, I would just maybe double down on the point we've repeatedly been making, that climate solutions that make for more inclusive communities that with higher levels of social well-being, those win-win responses to climate change, I think that's one way we do it. But I think the other thing I would maybe, again, caution us to not lose sight of is, as an oil and gas dependent region, if we don't account for the kinds of conversations that are going on globally around decarbonization and low carbon transitions, we're putting a bet on a particular energy future that says oil and gas are still going to be our bread and butter for the next 2, 3, 4 decades, right? That's a risk. We are putting all our chips on a particular bet, and that's putting us at risk of other kinds of social and economic impacts if we end up becoming a laggard relative to these kind of global communities that we're connected to very deeply, as Barb really nicely put it earlier on in the session. So, so I think that's also, build resilient, sustainable communities, but don't lose sight of the global conversation and what that means for us here, and our economies here, and our social well-being here, is where I would end it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Great way to finish. And it also will be a good segue to our next session, which I'll speak about in a second. First, I just want to thank the panel for a superb job on a tangly, very broad subject, but really brought it to life and some really tangible examples. So thank you for that. I want to remind everyone, because I know there's other questions in the Q&A and in the chat box, that you can go to our online forum for the ongoing conversation, because there's only so much we can cover live with people's ability to take in live sessions. So please go to www.harriscenterforum.ca/forecast-NL. It's on our website. By registering there, you'll be able to watch and rewatch any of the sessions, take part in the discussion forum, and Kathy and Mandy will be keeping track of that. Our panelists have all agreed to re-engage there as questions and comments come up. You can also suggest topics, ask for any further questions you might have related to today's panel. We haven't yet chosen a date for our next session, but we will be getting it in before we all break for hopefully summer when it arrives. We're all waiting, if you're on the East Coast, in rapt anticipation. We'll let you know that very soon about that next session, but it will be over the next few weeks, and it will be about the oil and gas industry. So as Mark mentioned, that's a real giant topic in this province, and we're very pleased with how that one's coming together. So stay tuned, and we'll get more details out soon. Thanks, as always, to the Harris Center team for pulling the session together. Thank you to John Duff and Conference Event Services at the Emira Innovation Exchange for the online and great, superb as always, help on that, John. And of course, thank you all for attending. Everybody's busy, everybody's zoomed out, but we know that as we look at the economic and fiscal issues, the climate change and the social, absolutely fundamental in all that. I think this session advanced the discussion. More to come online. Thanks again for taking part, and we'll see you at our next session. Take care.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.